If you believe in the laws of cause and effect as accepted, or in the laws of polarity as accepted and explained in a letter we received today, then you will be bound by those laws, for they will represent your artistic technique. You will believe that you must use them in order to, say, paint the living portrait of your life. You will therefore structure your experience, draw into yourself from framework 2 only that which fits. You will not have the technique to attract other experience. And as long as you stick with one technique, your life pictures will more or less have a certain monotony. Again, the writer or the artist also brings more into his work than the simple ability to write or paint. In one way or another, all of his experience is involved. When you pay attention to framework 1, primarily, primarily it is as if you have learned to write simple sentences with one word neatly before the other. You have not really learned true expression. In your life, you are writing sentences like, "See Tommy run." Your mind is not really dealing with concepts, but with the simple perception of objects, so that little imagination is involved. You can express the location of objects in space, and you can communicate to others in a similar fashion, confirming the physical, obvious properties that others also perceive. In those terms, using our analogy, the recognition of framework 2 would bring you from that point to the production of great art, where words served to express not only the seen but the unseen, not simply facts but feelings and emotions, and where the words themselves escaped their consecutive patterns, sending the emotions into realms that quite defied both space and time. Now and then people have such moments, and yet each private reality has its existence in an eternal creativity from which, again, your world springs. It is not as if that vaster reality were utterly closed to your perception, for it is not. To some extent, it is everywhere apparent in each person's private experience, and it is obviously stated in the very existence of your world itself. The religions, in one way or another, have always perceived it, although the attempt to interpret that reality in terms of the recognized facts of the world is bound to distort it. Give us a moment. Your world, then, is the result of a multidimensional creative venture, a work of art in terms almost impossible for you to presently understand, in which each person and creature and each particle plays a living part. Again, in framework 2, each event is known, from the falling of a leaf to the falling of a star, from the smallest insect's experience on a summer day to the horrendous murder of an individual on a city street. Those events each have their meaning in a larger pattern of activity. That pattern is not divorced from your reality, nor thrust upon you, not apart from your experience. It often only seems to be because you so compartmentalize your own experience that you automatically separate yourself from such knowledge. Creativity does not deal with compartments. It throws aside barriers. Even those people who are involved in creative work often apply their additional insights and knowledge only to their art, however, not to their lives, period. They fall back to cause and effect. Your framework 1 life is, again, based on the idea that you have only so much energy and that you will wear out, and that a certain expenditure of energy will produce a given amount of work. In other words, that applied effort of a certain kind will produce the best results. In the same way, it is believed that the energy of the universe will die out, all of this presupposes the fact that no new energy is inserted into the world. The source of the world would therefore seem no longer to exist, having worn itself out in the effort to produce physical phenomena. In the light of such thinking, framework 2 would be an impossibility. Instead, the energy of life is inserted constantly into your world in a way that has nothing to do with your so-called physical laws. I said 14 years ago, or is that 4, that the universe expands as an ideal does, and that is exactly what I mean. The greater life of each creature exists in that framework that originally gave it birth. And in a greater manner of speaking, each creature, regardless of its age, is indeed being constantly reborn. I am couching all of this in terms of your world's known reality, which means that I am dealing with the local properties of Framework 2 as they have impact in your experience. You will most probably have to end the session. Oh, he asked Rob to rest your fingers. You will most probably have to end the session, for there are points where the translation becomes most difficult. You both are privately at a time where you are ready to go ahead again, where the information given is catching up to you in time, so that there can be renewed burst of comprehension, dream experiences, and other such events. End of session. Thank you, Seth. This was really strange, Jane said when she finished her excellent delivery for Seth. I was surprised to see that she looked more than a little queasy. That's the first time that ever happened. I started to feel really sick, as though the material really got to me while he was giving it. Toward the end there was a strain involving things I couldn't translate, as though I was on the edge of getting some great stuff I've never heard of before. I still feel that way. Maybe my feelings weren't caused by anything but some kind of acceleration toward a state I couldn't reach, instead of any great disclosure for the world, Jane said a little later. But I really felt sick there. Her comments fit in well with Seth's closing statement about the difficulty of translation. Otherwise, we couldn't find a reason for her reactions in the session material itself. I suggested that the necessary insights would come to her later. It did seem that her odd state had its origins in her feelings of the afternoon and early evening. Okay. Now he's going to talk about editing and writing. So I'm going to skip down to where Seth speaks again. Dictation. You are, of course, a part of nature and a part of nature's source. Growing from an infant to a full adult was probably one of the most difficult and yet the most easy of feats that you will ever accomplish in a life. As a child, you identified with your own nature. You intuitively realized that your being was immersed in and a part of the process of growth. No amount of intellectual information, no accumulation of facts, however vast, could give you the inner knowledge necessary to accomplish the physical events involved in that growth process. You learn to read, but the seeing itself is an accomplishment of far greater magnitude, one that seemingly happens all by itself. It happens because each of you is, again, indeed a part of nature and of nature's source. In various ways, your religions have always implied your relationship with nature's source, even though they often divorce nature herself from any place of prime importance. For religions have often hinged themselves upon one or another quite valid perception, but then distorted it, excluding everything else that did not seem to fit. You are children of the universe. This is an often heard sentence, and yet the main point of the Christ story was not Christ's death, but his birth, and the often stated proposition that each person was indeed a child of the Father. There are many later appended references in the Bible, such as the fig tree story, in which nature is played down. Christ's Father was, however, the God who was indeed aware of every sparrow that fell, who knew of every creature's existence, whatever its species or kind. The story of the shepherds and flocks comes much closer to Christ's intent, where each creature looked out for the others. The officials of the Roman Catholic Church altered many records, cleansing them, in their terms, of anything that might suggest pagan practices or nature worship, as they thought of it. In terms of your civilization, nature and spirit became divided, so that you encounter the events of your lives largely in that context. To some degree or another, then, you must feel divorced from your bodies and from the events of nature. The great sweeps of emotional identification with nature itself do not sustain you, therefore. You study those processes as if you somehow stood apart from them. Give us a moment. To some extent, your society's beliefs allow you enough freedom so that most of you trust your bodies while they are growing toward adulthood. Then, however, many of you no longer rely upon the processes of life within you. Certain scientific treatises often make you believe that the attainment of your adulthood has little purpose except to ensure the further existence of the species through parenthood, when nature is then quite willing to dispense with your services. You are quite simply told that you have no other purpose. The species itself must then appear to have no reason except a mindless determination to exist. The religions do insist that man has a purpose, yet in their own confusion, they often speak as if that purpose must be achieved by denying the physical body in which man has his life's existence, or by rising above gross, blunted earthly characteristics, period. In both cases, man's nature and nature in general take short strife. Such tales are myths. They do indeed have power and strength. In those terms, they represent the darker side of myths. However, yet through their cast, you presently view your world. You will interpret the private events of your lives and the spectacular range of history in the light of those assumptions about reality. They not only color your experience, but you create those events that more or less conform to those assumptions. Those who lose their lives in natural disasters become victims of nature. You see in such stories examples of meaningless deaths and further proof of nature's indifference to man. You may, on the other hand, see the vengeful hand of an angry God in such instances, where the deity once again uses nature to bring man to his knees. Man's nature is to live and to die. Death is not an affront to life, but means its continuation, not only inside the framework of nature. This you understand it, as you understand it, but in terms of nature's source, it is, of course, natural, then, to die. The natural contours of your psyche are quite aware of the inner sweep and flow of your life and its relationship with every other creature alive. Intuitively, each person is born with the knowledge that he or she is not only worthwhile, but fits into the context of the universe in the most precise and beautiful of fashions. The most elegant timing is involved in each individual's birth and death. The exquisite play of your own inner nature in general, and that identification leads you into the deeper knowledge of your own part in nature's source. The myths upon which you base your lives so program your existence that often you verbally deny what you inwardly know. When people are hurt in a natural disaster, for example, they will often profess to have no idea at all for such involvement. They will ignore or deny the inner feelings that alone would give the event any meaning in their lives. The reasons for such involvement would be endless, of course, all valid. Yet in each and every case, man and nature in those terms would meet in an encounter that had meaning, from the largest global effects to the smallest, most private aspects of the individuals involved. You have made certain divisions because of your myths, of course, that make this kind of explanation extremely important and difficult. You think of rain or earthquakes as natural events, for example, while you do not consider thoughts or emotions as natural events in the same terms. Therefore, it is difficult for you to see how there can be any valid interactions between, say, emotional states and physical ones. You might say, of course, I realize that the weather affects my mood, yet it will occur to very few of you that your moods have any effect upon the weather. You have so concentrated upon the categorization, delineation, and exploration of the objective world that it surely seems to be the only real one. It seems to exert force or pressure against you, or to impinge upon you, or at least almost to happen by itself, so that you sometimes feel powerless against it. Your myths have given great energy to the outsidedness of things. In exasperation, some of you see nature as good and enduring, filled with an innocence and joy, while, on the other hand, you envision man as a bastard species, a blight upon the face of the earth, a creature bound to do everything wrong, regardless of any strong, good intent. Therefore, you do not trust man's nature either. This myth finds great value in the larger processes of nature in general, and yet sees man alone as the villain of an otherwise edifying tale. A true identification with nature, however, would show glimpses of man's place in the context of his physical planet, and would bring to the forefront accomplishments that he has achieved almost without his knowing. I will return to those accomplishments somewhat later. For now, I would like to mention some other issues involving the individual's connection either with natural disasters or with epidemics of one kind or another, that by definition concern large groups of people. You form your own reality. If you are tired of having me stress that point, I can only say that I hope the repetition will serve to make you understand that the statement applies to the most minute and the most important of the events that you experience. Some people believe that they must be punished, and so they seek out unfortunate circumstances. They go to one event after another in which they meet retribution. They may seek out areas of the country in which natural disasters are frequent, or their behavior may be such that they attract from other people reactions of an explosive kind. Often, however, the individuals use disasters quite for their own purposes as an exteriorized force that brings their lives into clear focus. Some may be flirting with the idea of death and choose a dramatic encounter with nature in the final act. Others change their minds at the last moment. Those involved in such disasters, the survivors, often use such larger-than-life circumstances in order to participate in affairs that seem to have greater import than those possessed by previous humdrum existences. They seek the excitement, whatever its consequences. They become a part of history to whatever extent. for once their private lives are identified with a greater source, and from it may derive new strength and vitality. Social barriers are dropped, economic positions forgotten. The range of private emotion is given greater, fuller sweep. To some extent or another, man's desires and emotions merge with the physical aspects of nature as you understand it, so that such storms or disasters are as much the result of psychological activity as they are of weather conditions. Objectively, whatever the appearances, storms, earthquakes, floods, etc., are quite necessary to the well-being of the earth. Both man's and nature's purposes are served then, though, generally speaking, man's myths make him blind to those interactions. People's thoughts and emotions always give clear clues whenever illness is involved, yet most people ignore such information. They censor their own thoughts. Many therefore fall prey to epidemics of one kind or another, because they want to, though they might deny this quite vigorously. I am speaking particularly of epidemics that are less than deadly, though danger is involved. In your times, hospitals, you must realize, are important parts of the community. They provide a social as well as a medical service. Many people are simply lonely or overworked. Some are rebelling against commonly held ideals of competition. Flu epidemics become social excuses for much needed rest, therefore, and serve as face-saving devices so that the individuals can hide from themselves their inner difficulties. In a way, such epidemics provide their own kind of fellowship, giving common meeting grounds for those of disparate circumstances. The epidemics serve as accepted states of illness in which people are given an excuse, for the rest are quite self-examination they desperately need, but do not feel entitled to otherwise. I do not mean to assign any hint of accusation against those so involved, but mainly to state some of the reasons for such behavior. If you do not trust your nature, then any illness or indisposition will be interpreted as an onslaught against health. Your body faithfully reflects your inner psychological reality. The nature of your emotions means that in the course of a lifetime, you will experience the full range of feelings. Your subjective state has variety. Sometimes sad or depressing thoughts provide a refreshing change of place, leading you to periods of quiet reflection and to a quieting of the body so that it rests. Fears, sometimes even seemingly irrational ones, can serve to rouse the body if you have been too lethargic or have been in a rut, psychologically or physically. If you trust or psychically, rather. If you trusted your nature, you would be able to trust such feelings, and following their own rhythms and routes, they would change into others. Ideally, even illnesses are a part of the body's health, representing needed adjustments, and also following the needs of the subjective person at any given time. They are a part of the interplay between the body and mind or spirit. The majority of my readers have come down with one or another disease, usually considered very dangerous, and without ever knowing it, because the body healed itself normally and naturally. The disease was not labeled. It was not given recognition as a condition. Worries or fears were not aroused, yet the disease came and vanished. In such instances, natural healing processes occurred, for which the body is seldom given credit. Such healings do not just involve changes in the body. For example, for a physical healing can take place because of events that seem utterly disconnected. Some portion of each individual is in direct contact with the very source of its own existence. Each individual is innately aware that help is available in every situation, and that information does not need to come through the physical senses alone. Many illnesses are cured then through quite natural methods that not only involve physical healings, but bring into play other events that have great bearing on the psychological elements that may be involved behind the scenes. For those interactions, we will have to look to Framework 2. End of session. Thank you. A fond good evening. The same to you. Good night. And now I will skip down. Well, I'll read some of this. Actually, the second Seven book named itself quite effortlessly as Jane worked on its first chapters, The Further Education of Oversoul 7. That's a book I'm going to have to read. I just know I'm going to have to read that one. I underlined the word story like this in Seth's material just to remind the reader that the Christ figure symbolizes our idea of God and his relationships. According to Seth, the man we call Jesus Christ was actually composed of three individuals who were the physical manifestations of the same non-physical entity: John the Baptist, St. Paul, and a man historically known as Christ. None of these were crucified. Their roles became blended and distorted in history. Seth discussed the Christ story in various passages in the Seth material and Seth Speaks, and has at least touched upon it in all of his succeeding books. Seth referred to the latest scientific ideas concerning selfish genes, a subject Jane and I had been talking about today. Genes are units found on the chromosomes of the cell nucleus. They carry hereditary characteristics and consist mainly of protein and DNA. Or, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word, some kind of acid. That's right there. A number of scientists, biologists, zoologists, and psychologists, among others, have recently published highly praised books in which they claim to show how our genes manipulate our individual behavior with only their own genetic survival at stake, even when we think we are displaying subjective qualities like altruism. Jane and I think the idea of such self-centered genetic behavior is much too limited, simple, and mechanistic, to use another term, that's currently in scientific vogue. The idea of selfish genes also implies plan on the part of such entities, and so comes dangerously close to contradicting several basic tenets of science itself. Among them, that life arose by chance, that it perpetuates itself through random mutations, and the struggle for existence or natural selection, and that basically life has no meaning. As I occasionally do in my notes, I am anthropomorphizing science by casting a multifaceted discipline in simple human or individual terms. But now it seems that when science claims to understand the workings of a molecule of DNA, for example, the master molecule of life, as it is often called, science then states that it stripped away the mystery of DNA and reduced our function to easily understood mechanistic ones. But Jane and I maintain that grasping the marvelous workings of DNA should instead increase our sense of the wonder and mystery of life. The DNA lies exposed in all of its parts, but the questions about the life within it remain unanswered. Why does science want us to live thinking that we're creatures programmed only for the survival of our selfish genes? Even the biologists and other scientists who insist upon our mechanistic basis do so with feeling. Next session. Now, good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. In the terms of our discussion, Framework 2 is the medium in which your world exists. It represents the vaster psychological reality in which your own subjective life resides. That framework has been glimpsed through history by many individuals and given many names. If you visit a foreign country, however, you have a tendency to describe the entire nation in terms of the small area you have visited, though other portions may be quite different in geography, culture, and climate. The individuals who have, to one extent or another, perceived Framework 2 have, then, described it according to their own brief visits, taking it for granted that the part was a representative sample of the whole. Plato conceived of it as the world of ideas, seeing within it the perfect model behind each imperfect physical phenomena. He thought of that realm as eternal and unchanging, a perfect but frozen composite that must indeed inspire men toward achievement on the one hand, and on the other reproach them for their failure, since their achievements must necessarily seem puny in contrast. Plato then saw Framework 2 as a splendid, absolute model in which all the works of man had their initial source. Man himself, according to this concept, could not affect that ideal world one whit. He could, however, use it as a source of inspiration. Some ancient religions put the existence of gods there and saw the spirits of each living thing as existing primarily in that invisible medium of reality. Therefore, Framework 2 has always been represented in one way or another as a source of your world. Christianity saw it as heaven, inhabited by God the Father, His angels, the saints, and the deceased faithful. Once scientists theorized the ether as the medium in which the physical universe existed. Framework 2 is the psychological medium in which the consciousness of the world exists. The word ego is much bandied about, and in many circles it has a poor reputation. It is, however, as I use it, a term meant to express the ordinary conscious directive portion of the self. It is your conscious version of what you are. An excellent description, if I do say so myself. It is directed outward into the physical world. It is also aware, however, of some of your unconscious activities. It is the you identify with. So it is aware of your dreams, for example, as you are, and it is quite conscious of the fact that its existence rests upon knowledge that it does not itself possess. As you have an ego, fully conscious, directed toward the physical world, we also have what I call an inner ego, directed toward inner reality. You have, in other words, a portion of yourself that is fully conscious in Framework 2, the ego of your ordinary world, which again we will call Framework 1, is uniquely equipped to deal with that environment. It manipulates with rules of cause and effect and consecutive moments. It deals with an objectified reality. It can stretch its capacities, becoming far more aware of inner events than it is normally allowed to do. But its main purpose is to deal with the world of effects, to encounter events. The inner ego is fully conscious. It is a portion of you, however, that deals with the formation of events, that glories in a rather rambunctious and creative activity that your specifications of time and place physically preclude. The unconscious, so-called, is, and I have said this before, quite conscious, but in another realm of activity. There must be a psychological chamber between these two portions of the self, however. These seemingly undifferentiated areas in which back and forth translations can occur. Dream periods provide that service, of course, so that in dreams the two egos can meet and merge to some extent, comparing notes like strangers who perhaps meet on a train at night and are amazed to discover, after some conversation, that they are indeed close relatives, each embarked upon the same journey, though seemingly they traveled alone. In those terms, the undifferentiated area is actually filled with motion as psychological transitions and translations are made, until in dreams the two egos often merge into each other, so that sometimes you waken briefly with a sense of elation or a feeling that in dreams you have met an old and valued friend. Your world is populated by individuals concentrating upon physical activities, dealing with events that are finished products, at least in usual terms. Your inner egos populate Framework 2 and deal with the actual creation of those events that are then objectified. Since the rules of Framework 2 are different, that reality is not at all bound by your physical assumptions. It contains, therefore, the inner ego of each individual who has lived or will ever live upon the earth. I am speaking of that framework now only as it applies to your world, not in its relationship to other realities. Earlier in his own experience, Rupert described that framework in psychic politics as the heroic dimension. He saw quite correctly that there was a great give and take between the two frameworks, your regular working one, Framework 1, and this other more comprehensive reality. He did not thoroughly understand, however, the creative ramifications involved, for it did not occur to him at the time that the prime work of your world was actually done by you in that other, wider aspect of your existence. Physically, you have at your fingertips certain accumulations of knowledge, objectified through the passage of information, verbally through the ages, in records or books, and through television. Now you use computers to help you process information, and you have a more or less direct access to physical knowledge. You acquired it through the use of your senses. There is systemized knowledge where men have accumulated facts in one particular field, processing it in one way or another. Your own senses bring you information each moment, and that information is in a way already invisibly processed according to your own beliefs, desires, and intents. You will ignore as information certain stimuli that another person, for example, will latch on to immediately. Even in your own world, then, your interests and desires serve as organizational processes that screen out certain information. The information available in Framework 2 is, in your terms, infinite. It is the source of your world, so therefore it contains not only all knowledge physically available, but far more. Give us a moment. I do not want to compare the inner ego with a computer in any way, for a computer is not creative, nor is it alive. You think, of course, of the life that you know as life, in capitals. It is, however, only the manifestation of what in those terms can only be called the greater life out of which your life springs. This is not to compare the reality that you know in derogative terms to the other source existence either. For your own world contains, as each other world does, a uniqueness and an originality that in those terms exist nowhere else. For no world of existence is like any other. The inner ego is a portion of the self, for example, is the portion of yourself that is aware of your reincarnational activities. It is the part of you that exists outside of time, yet simultaneously lives in time. You form your own reality. The ego that you are aware of obviously could not form your body for you, however, or grow your bones. It knows not how to assess the conditions of the world. Some words are kind of messed up. It makes deductions. Your reasoning is highly important, yet alone it cannot pump your blood or tell your eyes how to see. The inner ego does the actual work that brings about the events you have decided upon. In very simple terms, if you pick up a book and then do so, you experience that event consciously, though you are quite unaware of all of the inner events that occurred to bring the motion about. The inner ego directs those activities. If you want to change your job and hold that desire, a new job will come into your experience in precisely the same fashion, in that the inner events will be arranged by the inner ego. A body event involves the working of numerous muscles and joints and so forth. An event involving a job change concerns motion on the part of many people and implies a network of communication on the part of all the inner egos involved. Obviously, then, a mass physical event implies an inner system of communication of proportions that would put your technological communications to shame. Take your break, and I think I will. Already at 41 minutes.